Star Trek The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Number 3, Survival. Chapter 5. The Brickar was sitting up now, having been pulled to an upright position by Gower and Kodash. He sat there glowering. Staring back at him was Zach, standing a few feet away. The others were standing nearby, watching carefully. Zach seemed to have pulled his self-control back together. He had gone from denial of the truth to such blinding fury that they were concerned for a time that he might kill the prisoner if he got within range. Now, though, a calm had settled over him, a dangerous calm in Worf's opinion. It was almost easier to manage the Brickar cadet when he was raging. Now, he was a smoldering volcano, apparently ready to blow at any moment. "Who are you?" Zach interrogated. The Brickar said nothing. Zach repeated the question, this time in the native language of the Brickar. Still, the prisoner said nothing. Zach switched back to standard, and this time said, "I am Zach Kebron, of the clan Kebron. Of what clan are you?" Nothing. "I am making a formal interrogation of your rank and status in Brickar society," Zach said. "To refuse answers to risk immediate death challenge." "So challenge me," said the Brickar prisoner defiantly. "Kill me if you can. You'll be no closer to your answers than you were before, and at least I won't have to listen to the whining of some Federation tool who pretends he's a true Brickar." Worf glanced quickly to Zach. Zach was immobile. It was as if the words had passed right through him. "You are a terrorist," said Zach after a moment. "A terrorist and an independent operator, a disgrace to the Brickar. If you are waiting for me to confirm or deny your opinion, you will have to wait a very long time," shot back the Brickar. "Your insults are so much air, Kebron. You are beneath my notice." His large head swiveled to take in Salida. "You, on the other hand, Vulcan, there will be a reckoning between us. I assure you, I never forget." "Most elephants never do," Tanya put in tartly. Worf stepped back, assessing the situation. He gestured to Kalar, who joined him, and they turned away from the Brickar. "The Brickar appears determined not to cooperate," observed Worf. "This is not a surprise." Suddenly they heard a crash behind them. They spun. Salida, Tanya, and Kodash were doing everything they could to pull Zach away from the prisoner. The prisoner was on the ground, having been kicked over by an enraged Zach. "You dare call me a traitor? You are the traitor!" shouted Zach Kebron. "I am what I am, Kebron," shot back the Brickar prisoner from the ground. "Not some fake like you." Salida was doing her best to calm Zach down. She brought him over to a corner, whispering to him intently. He kept trying to look back at the fallen Brickar, who was at that moment being brought back to upright position in his chair by Gower and Mac. But Salida, with firm hands, brought his face back to look at hers. "Listen to me, Worf," said Kalar, low and intense. "I know what you will say, but it is madness to proceed in this manner. Let myself, Gower, and Kodash have an hour alone with him." "No!" "Half an hour, then." Her teeth flashed. We will find out everything he knows. He will beg to tell us whatever we need." "No!" he repeated more firmly. "Well, what would you do then, Worf?" Clearly, she was running out of tolerance for the situation. "Sit here in this manner until he becomes bored enough to give us the information?" "Blast it, Worf!" Her voice was starting to get louder. "If he had his way, the Vulcan would be dead. Given the opportunity, he would make certain the rest of us joined her. The creature deserves no special treatment. Why are you coddling him? What sort of Klingon are you?" "I," he said hotly, not caring if others were staring, "am a Starfleet cadet. My fellow cadets have designated me the group leader. I will not sanction torture of a prisoner. Not as long as any other means presents itself." "There is no other means." To their mild surprise, Mac stepped in between them. In as low a voice as possible, he said, "A cunning plan." Worf looked at him hopefully. "Yes?" Mac nodded firmly. "A plan so cunning you could stick a tail on it and call it a weasel." "And that would be?" prompted Kalar. "That what would be?" asked Mac. Worf was trying not to lose his patience. "The cunning plan! What is it?" Mac chucked a thumb towards Selita. "She can do it. Selita can." "Do what?" "Vulcan mind meld. Selita's very adept with basic mind brushes. That's why she's so good with calming people down, making them feel better. Mind brush is only one step below a full mind meld. She can do it." Worf and Kalar looked at each other and then back at Mac. "Since when did you become an expert on Vulcan mind techniques?" "I read a paper on it 3 years ago." He frowned and scratched his chin. "Or maybe I wrote it. Let me think." "Never mind. Selita!" Worf called over to her. "I know what you're going to ask," said Selita, approaching them slowly. "I overheard Mac's suggestion." Her glance flickered to Mac, and although her face was as impassive as always, she did not look particularly appreciative. "Worf, I would prefer another option." "I am open to suggestions," said Worf. "It is Kalar's thought that we simply resort to torture. Do you consider that to be acceptable?" She stared at him for a moment and then, surprisingly, lowered her gaze. "That is an unnecessary question. You know that, philosophically, I would consider such actions to be repugnant." "Selita, I would not force you—" She looked back up at him, her eyes hard and uncompromising. "You could not. Were you commander of a starship and I your subordinate, such an order would still overstep the bounds of propriety." Worf said nothing. Selita seemed to be staring deep into herself. Normally, Selita had no trouble expressing herself, but in this case, she was clearly having difficulty finding the words. The Vulcan mind meld is not an easy technique to master. It takes many, many years of practice. My teachers on Vulcan, I will admit, consider me to be something of a prodigy. They say I have a natural affinity for it. Nevertheless, I am not entirely comfortable in my abilities, and with the mind meld, the state of the mind of the initiator is crucial. "Are you afraid?" There was no challenge in Worf's voice. "Afraid?" She shook her head. "Of course not." "We forgot," said Kalar, sounding just a touch sarcastic. "Vulcans do not burden themselves with such petty concerns as fear." Selita replied without looking at her. "Lack of fear is one thing, Kalar. It does not mean, however, that I am bereft of concern for self-preservation. The ideal situation for a mind meld is when both participants are willing. It is a method of communion. Using a mind meld for interrogation is like using a hammer to crack someone's skull. It can be done, but that was not the original design of the tool, and the consequences can be dire for both parties. The Brickar is a strong, fierce personality. An accomplished melder could do what you desire, but it would be difficult. For myself, a novice..." And now she did turn and look at Kalar. "If I try to mind meld and extract information, I am putting myself at great risk and corrupting the intended use of the meld. If, on the other hand, I turn away and allow you to beat information out of him, I am a party to brutality. That is a choice you would have me make. I want you to understand that. I want both of you to understand." Worf simply nodded. There was nothing else that he could say. Chapter 6. Selita steepled her fingers, peering over the tops of them at the glowering face of the Brickar. She closed her eyes as if she hoped that the answer was written on the inside of her lids. Then she let out a slow, steady breath. When she looked at the Brickar once more, there was something in her eyes that he most definitely did not like. "Keep her away from me," he said fiercely. Selita either did not hear him or just did not care. She approached him slowly, tentatively, as if she were sizing him up. The Brickar had no clue as to what was happening. He looked from the Klingons to the cadets and then back to Selita. "I said keep her away." The Vulcan seemed to be drawing into herself. Her breathing was slowing down. Her attention was now fully focused on the Brickar. "Tell us what we want to know, Brickar," said Worf. Drop dead. Selita was now inches away from him. The Brickar looked up at her uncertainly. I'm not afraid of you, Vulcan, he said, rather unconvincingly. Her hands stretched out toward his face, her fingers wide apart. Her eyes were no longer focused on his face. Instead, they now seemed trained on a place somewhere in the back of his skull, as if she were looking right through him. The Brickar was tightly bound, hand and foot, to the heavy-duty chair. The cords were molecularly dense, used as strapping to move heavy equipment. He strained against them, but was unable to break them. Get her away from me, he shouted. But his gaze was locked with hers. His eyes were blazing. Hers were implacable. He tried to drive her away with the force of his stare, but there was no way that was going to work. Selita brought her hands up, brushing against his face. He jumped slightly, as if she had electric probes in her fingers. He tried to draw away from her, but he was unable to lean away even the least amount, a helpless victim of Selita's penetrating scrutiny. Very softly, so softly she could barely be heard, she whispered, Our minds are merging. His mouth was moving. He was trying to say no, but no words were coming out. Your thoughts are mine, intoned Selita. Your thoughts are mine. What you know, I know. The Brickar's eyes were so wide that Worf thought they were going to leap out of his face. I am Selita, she said. With her fingers spread across his face, she pushed her mind forward, encountering barriers and trying to shove her way past them. She had to establish her presence in his mind before she could learn what she needed to know. She had to proceed carefully. I am Selita. I am so Selita, the Brickar said. I am Selita. Both of them had said it together, and then she took it one step further. We are Selita. We are Selita. He tried to resist, but it only took a moment more for him to be droning in tandem with her. We are Selita. We are... This time she did not complete the sentence. Clearly she was waiting for him to provide his name. We are, she repeated steadily. Selita, Mark McHenry prompted from nearby. Tanya gestured for him to be quiet. The Brickar was resisting, but Selita, once embarked upon her course, would not be turned away. We are... He resisted for one last moment, and then the name exploded out of him. We are Bon, he gasped. Selita sagged a moment. The divining of this relatively small piece of information seemed to have exhausted her. But then she gathered her resources and pushed forward. Her fingers were inflexible. It looked now as if nothing less than snapping them off would get her to release her grip on the Brickar, whom they now knew to be named Bon. Her voice was unrelenting. We came to Dantar because... We came with a mission, he said. Although his eyes were wide open, he wasn't looking at anyone in the room. And the mission was... His mouth twitched. And the mission was... Selita repeated. It was an indicator of the strain she was under, because she actually sounded emotional when she said it. Hidden base. Worf's breath caught upon hearing these words. He looked at Kaler, who was likewise amazed. Ask him where, Worf demanded. But Selita didn't acknowledge the order. It was quite likely that she hadn't heard it at all. Why, she was asking. Why the attacks? Why? And then she began to answer herself. Her fingers, stiff as nails, were beginning to tremble. Her eyes were closed so tightly that tears were running down the sides of her face. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on some of the graveled tone of the Brickar. As for Bon, his mouth was forming the words, but all the voice was coming out of Selita. The Brickar want unlimited expansion privileges, Selita Bon said. Threaten to break off from Federation. Years of planning. Established. Selita stopped and took a deep breath. It seemed to cause her so much pain that she cried out, Worf started forward to put an end to it, but Tanya and Mac stopped him, taking him by either arm. "I wouldn't advise it," said Mac. Tanya was nodding. "Yank her out of it now. It could be dangerous. Like a diver being brought up too fast from the deep. She could get the mental equivalent of the bends." Worf looked from them to Salida. Salida practically shouted the word, "Established!" as if it were a jam that she were trying to punch past. "Established!" And then it came out in a rush. "Established! Hidden bases within range of Federation borders. Main one on Dantar 4. Way in is... Her body started to convulse with a strain, and she screamed. It was a terrifying thing to hear, the controlled, calm Salida crying out as if her soul were being wrenched from her body. It was enough for Worf. He tore loose from his classmates, ran to Salida, and yanked her away from the Brickar. Her arms remained rigid, her fingers outstretched. She gave no sign that she knew contact had been broken. "She's not breathing! Her breathing stopped!" Zach Keeburn shouted, and it had. She was utterly paralyzed, as if her body had simply shut down. Worf lay her down, tilting her head back to clear the passage to her lungs. The Brickar, in the meantime, began to regain some semblance of normality. Understanding started to return to his eyes, and it seemed as if he were waking from a deep dream. Worf started to lean down to Salida, then realized her eyes were focused on him. "Worf," she said slowly. You had stopped breathing." "I was in a trance, Worf," she informed him. "I was breathing, but at a much slower rate than normal. It was in order to bring myself gradually out of the mind meld. Such things cannot be flipped on and off, like a switch." "Oh," was all I could think of to say. "Would you be good enough to help me up?" He backed up, took Salida by the hand, and brought her to her feet. She brought her hands up to her face to compose herself and felt the wetness on her cheeks. She did an excellent job of covering the surprise she felt upon discovering it. "I was not crying?" she asked uncertainly. Tanya shook her head. "Just reflex. Your eyes were squeezed so tightly that it activated your tear ducts. Just a biological thing. Nothing, emotional." Salida nodded, as if she had known all along that this would be the case. I had no doubt. With Salida's welfare attended to, their concentration switched to their prisoner. Bond looked up at the scowling faces of Worf, Zach, and the others, but there was a lot less of the earlier defiance in his expression. Zach was the first to break the silence. "Greetings, Bond. How nice to know who we're talking to."
"You have told us much of what we need to know," said Worf. "The only question that remains is, how easily do you wish matters to go for you?"
"Why does that make any difference to you?" sneered Bond. But there was a lack of certainty in his behavior, and made Worf suspect that Bond had only the haziest recollection of what had just occurred. At the moment, Bond was off balance and vulnerable. Now was the time to try and pry the rest out of him.
"It does not make a difference to me," Worf said, sounding utterly casual. "After all, we now know of the hidden base and your attempts to get to it. We know of your mission to get rid of the colonists, either by driving them away or simply killing them to gain access to the base."
Worf was guessing, of course, basing his conjectures on what they already knew and building upon it. Bond, however, did not know that, and his expression of total shock was enough to confirm to Worf that the guesses were correct. He pressed the advantage.
"Now you can tell us the rest voluntarily, if you wish, or else we will simply turn Salida loose on you again."
This was a complete bluff. Worf had already resolved that there was simply no way he was going to subject his Vulcan classmate to that sort of stress again. But Bond did not know that, nor for that matter did Salida. She was, however, Vulcan, and consequently was quite expert in keeping her feelings to herself. Her face was expressionless. She looked perfectly capable of once more forcing herself into the Brickar's mind and extracting, like a dentist, the information she desired. Worf leaned in closer until his face was mere inches away from Bond's. He indicated Salida with a tilt of his head.
"Will you speak before I unleash her on you once more? Because if you do not, we will still obtain the information we desire, and you will be left with as much mental agility as a potted plant. It is your decision, Bon of the Brickar. Make it carefully.
Brickar did not sweat, but if they did, then Bon would have been sweating buckets at that moment. Worf shrugged his shoulders.
Very well. Salida?
He gestured for her to come forward. She did not hesitate, approaching Bon with her fingers outstretched. She looked as if she were capable of simply reaching into his head, scooping out his brains and examining them.
All right, shouted Bon. All right, just keep her away.
Worf put up a hand, stopping Salida in her place.
Salida, it will not be necessary.
To Worf's surprise, she actually managed to put on an air of bitter disappointment. Are you sure? She asked, sounding brittle.
For the moment.
She played it to the hilt. You should not tease me, Mr. Worf. You know that my sources of genuine pleasure are few, and I have not drained anyone of everything they know in such a long time. Vulcans did not lie, nor had Salida lied now. There was, in fact, not all that much that made her happy, for pleasure was too strong a word to use when it came to Vulcans. Fulfillment might be the strongest, and since Salida had, in fact, never drained anyone of everything they knew, saying that it had been a long time was the slightest stretch of the truth. But she had spoken in such deadly earnest tones that the Brickar was visibly trembling. This was in stark contrast to Tanya, who was standing behind Bon, out of sight. She had her mouth covered, her shoulders shaking in amusement. Mark McHenry, who had not fully caught on, was gaping at Salida in astonishment. Zack had his back turned, and it was not possible to see his reaction. Worf, poker-faced, played along.
If he does not fully cooperate, I shall permit you to...
He paused, searching for the right words.
To have your way with him.
Thank you, Mr. Worf, she said. She bowed slightly at the waist and stepped back.
I will cooperate, I promise you,
said the Brickar wholeheartedly.
Good.
Worf folded his arms and waited. The Brickar sighed.
Everything you've said is true. My mission was to try and drive the colonists off the planet. My ship was specially designed using Klingon-designed Federation weaponry. We wished to be rid of the colonists in whatever way we could, whether it be through causing divisiveness between them or rendering the planet inhabitable. It made little difference. We did not wish, however, to launch an all-out attack for fear of drawing the full attention of the Federation to our activities before we were ready. Yes, there is a hidden base. At the time we established it here, the colony did not exist. That was a relatively recent development. Since this part of Dantar is one of the more habitable, it was natural for us to build our base here, and just as natural, unfortunately, for the colonists to establish their colony here as well. The entrance to the base is hidden beneath the building in which the colony's central generators are housed. I tried to keep damage to that structure to a minimum in my attacks. Unfortunately, the entrance is only accessible by means of a signaling device that was in my ship, a device destroyed when I crashed. I had been endeavoring to repair it, although with little success. That, and to survive as best I could. But after several days with the device still unrepaired and my supplies running low, I signaled for help. That was when, and he paused, looking distastefully at Salida, that was when she showed up. This base, said Worf. What is in there?
Weaponry mostly. Everything needed to establish Dantar 4 as a strategic military point, particularly for guerrilla operations.
And subspace transmission equipment?
Of course, said Bond, sounding a bit scornful.
How powerful?
Extremely. You could bounce a signal off the Andromeda Galaxy if you wanted to. We could summon help, Tanya said in a low voice. Beam an emergency message straight into the heart of Federation territory. Worf nodded, stroking his chin.
How do we gain access?
Bond regarded him with a flickering of his old contempt. Are you deaf, Klingon? I told you already. Via a signaling device is no longer operational. Now Tanya stepped forward. How did it operate? Varying scale of tonal frequencies, set to a pre-established code. Do you know what the code is? Bond shook his head. No, but if you want, I can bring you to the entrance. If you wish, I will even accompany you inside. Worf looked at him suspiciously.
You seem rather eager to be of help all of a sudden.
I have no more desire to spend the rest of my days here than you do.
Again, Worf seemed to consider him. What happened to the colonists?
They left.
Bond looked at him oddly. You were there. You saw it yourself. But rescue vessels should have been sent by now. That has not been the case. So what happened to them? Do you have any suspicions?
Suspicions? I suspect they fell into a black hole. I suspect they were sliced to ribbons by a cosmic string fragment. I suspect their engines ruptured. I suspect they were intercepted by Romulans. I suspect many things, Klingon. Of what possible use are suspicions? The fact is that I have no more idea of their fate than you do. If that was not the answer that you desired to receive, then that is much more your problem than mine.
Indeed. That being the case, Bond, I believe that you will stay here for a time. Once we have managed to enter the hidden base, summon help, and ensure our rescue, you will be released.
You're a fool, snapped Bond. You'll never get in there without my help. It's insanity to reject my offer of help.
Worf's lips thinned. If that was not the answer that you desired to receive, then that is much more your problem than mine.
The Brickar snarled upon hearing that. As if Bond's presence were no longer of any consequence, Worf gestured for the others to follow him out the door. Kaler assigned Gower to keep an eye on the Brickar, and moments later everyone else was standing outside the building. Some of them were barely able to contain their excitement. What a coup! Tanya practically crowed. If we can find this hidden base of theirs, then all of this will have been worth it.
Do not get too excited, Worf cautioned her. First, we have to find the base. Second, we have to be able to get in.
I wouldn't be too concerned about that, Tanya replied. All this time that we've been sitting around here, we've been going out of our minds because of our inability to accomplish anything. Well, that's changed. This is exactly the type of challenge we need.
Get on it, then, said Worf.
She tossed off a salute, a rather tongue-in-cheek maneuver since salutes were hardly required in Starfleet. She gestured for Mark to follow her, and they headed off toward the building where Tanya had been doing most of her engineering work. Worf turned to Selita.
Are you all right?
He asked. Without Bond around, there was no need for him to disguise his concern. She nodded. I am recovered, she said carefully. Do not concern yourself, Worf. It was not one of the more pleasant experiences of my life, and I have no overwhelming urge to repeat it, but I shall survive intact.
I had no doubt, he replied.
Zach Kieran, for his part, was standing off to the side. He was paying only partial attention to what was being said, for his mind was in turmoil over their recent discoveries. When Worf stepped up to him, Zach did not look as if he were particularly relishing the coming conversation.
All these things that Bond said about growing hostility toward the Federation, Worf began carefully.
Having no patience for dancing around difficulties, Zach said bluntly, You wish to know if they are true, and if they are true, you wish to know why I have said nothing of them before this. Worf nodded. Zach sighed. He noticed Kaler and Kodash standing nearby within earshot. He could have tried to chase them away, take out his frustration on them, but what possible purpose would that serve?
There had been talk, he said. But Worf, you must understand, my people like to talk very loudly about a great many things. There had been anti-Federation sentiment expressed, yes, also anti-Klingon, anti-Romulan, and on and on. The Brickar are somewhat aggressive, and not exactly pioneers in tolerant species relations. That much you must certainly know by now. It had come to my attention, Worf said dryly. That being the case, continued Zach, I had no way of knowing that sentiment would take this sort of shape, no way of knowing that anything would come from it, let alone hidden bases and such. Now Kaler stepped forward. Nevertheless, you do realize it puts you in a precarious position, security-wise. Worf looked at her. Oh, really? Yes, really. He's a member of a species known to be hostile. What are you suggesting? Demanded Zach, bristling. That I should be made prisoner alongside Bond? Would that serve your ends? I am simply pointing out what we already know, Worf cut her off. You're not seriously suggesting that one member of the Brickar be penalized because of the actions of another? No, said Kaler said Kalair evenly. I am not. I have made my observations and have done my duty by stating them. If you feel that he is trustworthy, then your opinion as leader of your team must take precedence.
Thank you,
he said. He turned to Kodash.
And do you have anything you wish to contribute to this discussion?
For a moment, Kodash said nothing. Zach braced himself, prepared for an outpouring of verbal abuse. Worse, he was certain that the Klingon would start gloating over the fact that not only had Zach been wrong about the attackers being Klingon, but that it was in fact one of Zach's own people who had assaulted them. It was none other than a Brickar who had made them prisoners on Dantar 4. Kodash was undoubtedly going to rub it in, and there was nothing that Zach could do to contradict such sentiments. Zach waited.
You must feel greatly humiliated that it was one of your own people who attacked us, Kodash said.
Zach said nothing. Kodash glanced briefly at Worf and then looked back to Zach.
I know how I would feel were I in your position. I am glad that I am not.
Then he turned and walked away. Zach couldn't believe it. That was it? The whole confrontation? He looked to Worf in amazement.
I thought that was heartfelt. Did you not think so?
Worf asked.